Chapter 21. 3 weeks passed, and Charles and I were still living in the cabin. At this point, there was a foam mattress in the living room area that I pulled out at the end of each day and slept on, right next to the coffee table. Charles slept on the couch when he wasn't blacked out in some other random spot inside of or around the cabin. Somehow or another, Charles had already taken care of the whole lost paperwork thing with the van. He did it from a library computer, too. I don't know what he did, nor did I ask. All I know is he made it look like I was the rightful owner of the van. The plates were supposed to come in the mail any day now. Today, while I waited for that, I was scribbling away in that little yellow pad of mine. With the ever-pressing stress of getting back to my sales job, I was lucky to have such a time-consuming hobby to distract me. Otherwise, I'd have just been pacing around, smoking and chewing on my fingernails. I felt a bit like a housewife, being left alone each day while Charles and Grandfather Red Eagle went off to go catch game with their bare hands. Apparently, Grandfather Red Eagle was able to kill so many animals that hunting alone was lucrative enough for him to not need a job, even with the licensing fees. He even had a hunting rifle that he never used, just to keep the game warden from asking too many questions. Combine that with Social Security, and he was able to live like a king by his own standards. It wasn't much, he admitted, but hey, he was a single guy, so what did he have to fuss about? With Charles coming to help him, letting me eat and sleep on his dime wasn't too much of a hassle. I'd offered to go look for a job in town, but nonsense, he'd be able to help me out with gas money when the plates came in. No need to risk getting caught by the Wendigo on the way to work. Not that I didn't appreciate everything he was doing so freely for me, but Jesus H. Christ, the boredom was starting to get to me. I knew that if I was ever able to turn the writing into a full-time gig, I was going to need a list of other things to do throughout the day. A gym membership, a part-time job, a garden, a fucking stamp collection, something to fill that time gap between getting burned out on writing and going to bed. As I sat staring out the window, racking my brain for the next slew of words to vomit onto the page, my thoughts wandered elsewhere and I lit up with a sudden question. Why was Charles still here? Wasn't the whole point of the expedition to get advice or resources or something so he could go get his baby mother back? Had he even spoken to Grandfather Red Eagle about it? If so, I didn't hear about it. By the looks of everything, it seemed to me like he was just up here to drink booze and smoke a fancy pipe with feathers hanging from it. It seemed to me for all intents and purposes that the whole thing was pointless. Pointless, yes, what a concept. It seemed to be a recurring theme lately. My sales job started looking pretty pointless once I got to thinking about it. I mean, shit, the Indian was right in all honesty and truth. I didn't actually give a damn about being a salesman, and that could very well manifest in my performance on the job if I was ever able to make it there. Not that it mattered, being as I hadn't made it there. No job skills for me, no fruitful career, just strange places and weird people with the side of literal supernatural monsters breathing down my neck. Thoughts like these began to tornado around in my head, and I stopped myself when I noticed how heavily I was breathing and how hard I was grinding my teeth. Like always, I thought back to Ziegler and all the rest of that positive thought motivational jibber-jabber I'd been trying so hard to internalize this whole time. It's sort of like realizing your house is almost engulfed in flames and rushing over to the water spigot with a bucket in hand. Cool down, think positive. I got up to take a walk. I couldn't take just sitting in that little cabin any longer. I needed to get outside and close to nature. Before I went outside, I searched around in all the kitchen drawers looking for rolling papers and maybe some kind of weird hidden surprise or something. The latter I didn't find, just the usual rags and utensils, but I did find papers in that one drawer where you keep all the magnets and keychains and other loose shit you don't know what else to do with. I took the papers to the table so I could roll a few cigarettes for the trip. My cigarettes weren't the tightest, but at least they were cylindrical. I rolled 4 of them and left the rest of the papers and tobacco on the table. I used the key in the mailbox to lock the door behind me and set off. When I take a walk, I wander aimlessly and for at least an hour. I've done it since I was a little kid, and I'll do it for as long as I can walk, and if my legs ever quit on me, then I'll get real buff arms pushing myself in a wheelchair. It's the best way for me to calm the hurricane that occasionally blows around inside me. Something to smoke on is always a plus on top of it. My preference, of course, is a joint, but a half-heartedly rolled cigarette works just fine. I wasn't following a trail, and I didn't really know where I was going, so I made sure to walk in a fairly straight line. That way I could just turn 180 when I was ready to head back. When I was younger and a lot more angsty, imagine if you will, I'd always stare straight down at my feet as I walked, but eventually I learned to cut that out and pay attention to all the pretty things around me. In a big city, the sights are cool for a while when it's all still new and curious, but I'll swear up and down, I could walk the exact same route in a forest or a desert and never ever get tired of the plants. Out here in these Idaho woods, the trees were skyscrapers and the bushes were my fellow pedestrians. Cities like that are the greatest. The people never shoot you dirty looks or ask you for crystal, no cars around to choke you with the nasty emissions or rip by in front of you when you're supposed to be able to cross the street, and best of all, it's quiet. Trees and bushes and mountains are always prettier than streets and buildings, but nothing will ever be more beautiful than peace and quiet, maybe with just a sprinkle of cicadas and rustling leaves. But anyways, the point is, that type of shit is the miracle cure for when I'm groveling internally and the motivational slogans aren't helping. Once I'd gotten the wiggles out from walking and all my stressful thoughts had faded away from gazing at all the pretty stuff, I'd traveled for a pretty decent amount of time. How long I couldn't say. I wasn't keeping track of time. That must have been Grandfather Red Eagle's secret. I'd just smoked my last cigarette and was thinking about turning around when I smelled something nasty. It was faint overall, but just strong enough to make me wonder. I only had to keep walking in the same straight line for the odor to strengthen, meaning I was about to find whatever it was coming from. Though on a conscious level I didn't particularly want to see or even know about the thing I was looking for, the awful, sweet and sour rottenness lit my subconscious aflame with curiosity, propelling my legs forward with all the eagerness to keep on marching towards it, even picking up the pace so I could get a glimpse of it sooner. As the smell became so strong that it swallowed me up with the whole surrounding area, I wondered how Charles must have felt when he found himself in a similar situation, or even just dogs in general with that heightened sense of smell. It made me more thankful than anything else. Then came the buzzing, off to the left. That had to be it. I knew I was getting close with each step from that point on. Not only did the buzzing get louder, but the smell increased exponentially. When I reached a big clump of bushes and trees that reminded me of the one Charles had caught Grandfather Red Eagle hiding in, I knew then and there that the source of the nauseating combination of odor and low buzzing was right behind it. At this point, the day was reaching dusk, so I wasn't able to tell what was in the little alcove through the tunnel-like gap in the plants just by peering inside. Going in was the only option. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me harder than ever before, and I was immediately repulsed back outside. I'd come this far, so I took a deep breath, held it, and stepped back in. It's hard to hold your breath when you have to pull acrobatic stunts to step over the sideways tree trunks and duck away from all the pokey twigs and branches, but luckily the tunnel stretched only a few short feet before it curved off to the left and I got into the chamber. It was a circular enclosure, 10 or 15 feet in diameter, closed off on all sides by trees and bushes aside from the hole I'd just crawled through. It was dark, so I couldn't see everything with full clarity, but it was easy to tell what sort of person might live in there. Dozens of empty packages and containers once holding things like beans, potato chips, bread, and instant macaroni were scattered about, covering the ground, along with eating utensils, pocket knives, dirty garments, pill bottles, and everything imaginable. I wasn't interested in any of that, though. The buzzing, as I'd suspected before and could now see, was coming from a massive swarm of flies, all of them hovering around and crawling in and out of the alcove, sprawled out with a bulge underneath that was too wide and too tall to just be a lone sleeping tweaker. I knew my weak smoker lungs would need to inhale very soon, so I acted fast, but still stepping lightly so as not to step on a needle by accident. Kneeling down just low enough to reach the edge of the quilt with 2 pinching fingers, I leaned back as far as I could and tossed it up to see what it was hiding. Chapter 22. The longer Charles stayed with his baby mother's family, the more the lost dog signs began to appear on lampposts and telephone poles around town. People were starting to talk. It couldn't be coyotes. With the poodles and the beagles, it was feasible, but no way they could have gotten the Great Danes and the German Shepherds and Rottweilers that were disappearing along with them. Cougars had been known to show up every once in a while, but not this often. Besides, if a neighborhood dog was killed by a cougar, the body would most likely be close by for someone to stumble across. These dogs had simply vanished, and even an outsider would be able to tell by the inconsistency between all of the beware of dog signs and the general lack of barking. Charles, now on his 4th month in the household, was still looking for a job. The family didn't mind too much since he hadn't caused any trouble and paid for his own food and cigarettes with food stamps and odd manual labor here and there. He was a big help whenever something needed to be moved, too, him and his truck both. The only real domestic spats he had were with his baby mother, usually behind a closed bedroom door in hissing whispers. She didn't like it when he stayed out past 2 in the morning, and especially not when he came back with liquor on his breath. In truth, he hadn't really planned to spend so much time away from her originally, nor to be drinking as heavily as he was, but he also hadn't planned on knocking up such a psychotic bitch as her either. He'd made a couple of buddies out here that he ran around drinking with and having midnight bonfires in illegal places, each time venting to the guys about how beyond insane she was, even for a pregnant woman. Her mood swings were out of this world, and every 20 minutes or so, she had something new to nag him about. Sometimes she would look up at the ceiling and blurt out some strange statement that she might have meant as a hint towards something, or maybe even some kind of a joke that not a soul on God's green earth would have understood but her. She would complain about how fat she was getting despite knowing fully well that it was part of the natural process. At all times, she had a stash of off-brand Dr. Pepper, and Lord have mercy on anyone who dared to even think about so much as looking in its direction. Worst of all, she'd scroll through her phone on a constant basis, reading celebrity tabloids and shouting the headlines out loud for the world to hear. Time and time again, Charles would tell her that if it wasn't about Clint Eastwood or Tarantino, he didn't give a shit, but she would ignore him and give him an update on Kylie Jenner in 5 minutes anyways. His friends would always laugh and make fun of him when he told them horror stories from his home life. "Shit, man," they'd say. "That's what condoms are for." Even as they laughed at his woes and said these things, they were really reminding themselves to be careful or they'd end up just like old dickhead McGee over here. He knew it, and they knew he knew it. That was okay, though. Once they were done with their drag Charles through the coals routine, they'd always remind him of what a bunch of top-notch uncles they'd all be once the baby was born. While baby mother's instability was easy enough to handle in this way, Charles's real problem was one that he'd have to face alone. Shaving was a constant struggle. Late in the month, he'd take a garbage bag into the shower to catch all the hair that grew so thick around his whole body that letting it flow down the drain without a doubt would cause an immediate need for a plumber. Once he was done, he'd crumple up the bag and hide it under his towel as he left the shower. Then once he was dressed, he'd discreetly go out and stuff it under the driver's seat of his truck. This wasn't awfully complicated, but when his teeth would glow, there wasn't much he could do but avoid opening his mouth too wide. If it weren't for them already being a little long and crooked in the first place, he'd never be able to pass it off. As the weeks neared the full moon, Charles would have to deal with his growing hunger for meat. Fast food and jerky wouldn't cut it. If only the neighborhood knew how low the populations of coyotes and cougars were getting right alongside the dogs. Sometimes he'd venture out a little further into the countryside, picking off a cow or a goat or a pig late at night when his baby mother thought he'd just been out partying. It was a lot to juggle, but so far he'd managed to keep it all on the down low. Nobody knew Charles's secret but him, and that was all right for the time being. Too bad, though, because that house of cards he'd been so carefully building was just about to topple. The uncle, the smart one who was into the conspiracy theories, started to act funny around Charles. He still talked to him, but said less. He stopped offering beers. He'd been eyeing Charles with a suspicious squint. The clues weren't necessary, though. Charles had the discernment, and he could already sense a shift in Uncle's energy. A shift towards a slight but growing air of hostility. Everything was confirmed the night Uncle came home with a shopping bag from the local bookstore and took them straight to his bedroom, refusing to let anyone see what he'd bought. Charles stayed in that night. His drinking buddies hit him up. He texted back saying he couldn't go out tonight, blaming his baby mother's bad mood. This was a lie. She was actually in pretty good spirits tonight. He sat in the living room with her, Mom, and Granny watching some stupid Dwayne The Rock movie. He cuddled with her on the couch and nodded whenever she read him a tabloid. All the while, he used his trusty Wolfman hearing, listening for Uncle to go to the restroom. The movie was almost over when it finally happened. Charles waited a moment, just in case it was only a quick piss. The door shut. The toilet lid opened. He could even hear Uncle's pants unzipping. He waited another 5 seconds. Silence. Uncle was either dropping a deuce or choking the chicken. Now was the chance. Charles excused himself for a cigarette. He brushed off his baby mother tugging at his shirt, insisting that he stay put or he'd miss the good part of the movie. It was cigarette time, he told her. She let him go, rolling her eyes, groaning that it was always cigarette time. Charles tiptoed past the bathroom and into Uncle's bedroom, tightly gripping the doorknob so it wouldn't squeak as he cracked it open. The light was on. The computer was off. The books were laid out on the bed. Uncle had been reading. Charles stepped up to the bed and leaned over to get a glimpse. His heart started racing. His nightmare had been realized. Uncle had gathered a small database of information on werewolves, folklore, fact and fiction, historical studies, pop fiction, you name it. Whether the information in those books was at all accurate, who could say, but that wasn't the point. The point was, somebody was onto him. Charles slipped out of the bedroom and out to the front porch. He'd just pulled a cigarette out when Uncle came out of the bathroom. Charles watched him pass down the hall through the screen door. The bedroom door shut. Cue a cigarette time, most nervous. The rest of that night was pretty much business as usual. The only thing out of the ordinary was that something must have been off about Charles's sexual performance, because after they'd finished, baby mother asked him what was wrong. He blamed it on stress, which was the truth, but his reasoning was that he worried about finding a job in time for the baby to come. In reality, he was planning to take her away the moment she turned 18 and live a werewolf's life somewhere far away from any town or neighbors, but she didn't have to know that just yet. When twilight was approaching for the first full moon of the month and Charles was just about to step out the door, Uncle called his name from the kitchen and stopped him dead in his tracks. He needed help with something, a bookshelf that he was picking up from somebody's house. It was a heavy one, and he could really use a pickup and an extra pair of hands. No, sorry, Charles couldn't do it tonight. He was already about to go help somebody else. They were moving, see, and they had a lot of shit in the house. Sorry, maybe next time. Charles slammed the door behind him and dashed to the truck as soon as he was sure nobody was watching. The routine pentagram on his hand was starting to burn. It does that when it's almost time. So far, he'd managed to hide it from everybody, since it usually comes in waves and usually just in the evening when he could conceal it in the dark. Every once in a blue moon, it would show up during the day, but he was always able to excuse himself to the bathroom and wait a few minutes for it to pass. Just now, when Uncle was talking to him, Charles had his hands in his pockets. He drove out to the edge of the desert, past the farms where he'd sometimes come to feast on the livestock, and parked on the side of the road. The sky was pink, and the dying cheatgrass waved at him as far as he could see. He figured he'd be waking up in those dusty mountains the next morning next to some sagebrush. No way in hell was he going to stay in town when the moon was full anymore. He lit a cigarette to prepare, and then the first convulsion hit. Way back when I was telling you about the time I was talking to Charles outside that motel room and he suddenly doubled over from sharp pain, that was a pre-transformational convulsion. It's a without warning shock to the body, a signal that it's getting very close to huffing and puffing time. Nobody's 100% sure what it is, since lycanthropic transformations aren't a subject of study at any medical universities, but the consensus among the tribe of the demon wolf is that the convulsions are a symptom of hormonal resistance to the changes beginning to take place. It involves intense muscle contractions, which, they say, is an attempt to resist the unnaturally far stretching. Once it was over, Charles picked his burning cigarette off the vehicle floor where he'd dropped it, stuck it back in his mouth, and drove up closer to the mountains, going far above the speed limit in case he was hit with another one before he got there. He arrived at the foot of one of the mountains just in time because the next convulsion came not 30 seconds after he shut off the truck. Once it was over, and he was done wiping the sweat from his forehead, he changed into the sweatpants he'd brought along with him. This precaution was one he'd started taking after he was almost caught sneaking back into the house naked last month. Once he was dressed for the occasion, he ventured on up the mountain in his bare feet, soon to be hardened paws. The usual ensued, and when Charles woke up, he was laying in the dust next to some sagebrush. What woke him was the hiss of a rattlesnake, which he promptly seized by the neck and ripped in half with his teeth the second he opened his eyes. He rose to his feet, beat the dust out of his body hair, and followed the smell back to his truck. He changed back into his clothes and took his phone out of his pocket. "Where are you?" said a text from his baby mother, preceded by 7 missed calls. He sighed, then sat in the front of the seat, pulling out the bottle of old number 7 he kept stashed under his coat behind the passenger seat. He sipped until he felt better, then got a cigarette going. "Sorry," he texted her back. "There was a lot of shit to move. Ended up getting drunk and staying the night. Be home soon." He put the phone back in his pocket and ignored when it vibrated a mere few seconds later. He sipped on the bottle and stared out the front windshield. The sun was out. He wasn't about to check his phone, so he guessed it must be about noon. He lifted his shirt and looked down at his torso with the dried blood of who knew who or what, knowing he'd have to get a shower at a truck stop on the way back. And shave in the process. He started the truck and started on his way, hoping against hope that it would all be worth it. Chapter 23. It was a long time before I looked behind me as I sprinted away from that alcove. I didn't stop to look, mind you. I kept my ass running, leaping over rocks and branches on the ground, just taking a quick glance every now and then to see if anything was gaining on me. Nothing was immediately visible, but it was dark out now, so I wasn't about to waste any time. Besides, despite not seeing anything, there was no question that I felt a presence. Something was chasing me, or at the very least watching. I picked up speed when the cabin came in view. I wasn't even trying anymore, just looking straight ahead as my body soared toward it. When I got to the door, I held my hands out for impact before they smashed into the wood. I scrambled in my pockets until I found the key, ripping the door open and slamming it shut, rattling the walls, then locked the deadbolt. Now that I was done running, my breath caught up with me. I had to pace around in a circle for a while. It hurt too much to breathe standing still. Goddamn cigarettes. I flicked on the lights. Nobody was home yet. I dashed around to every window and dropped the blinds. There was nothing else I could do, so I sat down at the coffee table where I'd left the tobacco and the rolling papers. So I sat there, hunched over, wailing on my fingernails. The only thoughts in my head were images of what I saw when I lifted that blanket. It was like watching commercials on television. Constant pictures lunging at me, assaulting me, one after another, pulling me in and reducing my mind to an infantile state. Every thought jamming itself in, none of them my own. It was like damnation, a constant loop of torment while I was too docile to even notice it. Finally, I snapped out of it. I took my fingers out of my mouth and looked at them. I've always thought that chewed up fingernails with their raw, tattered skin and their ugly, jagged edges are something of a reflection of the chewer's mental state. I got up to go wash my hands, then back to the fridge where I got a beer and brought it back to the table. I rolled a cigarette and reflected on what had just happened over smoke puffs and beer gulps. When I said that I tossed up the blanket, I meant that I threw it back with enough force to not only remove it completely from what was underneath, but also to send a tidal wave of stench directly at my face. It didn't matter that I'd been trying to hold my breath. It was strong and human enough to sting my eyes and force me to open my mouth reflexively from the shock of that alone. That was when I got a big, strong whiff of death rushing straight into my mouth and down my throat. When I say whiff of death, I mean the smell of rotting flesh. You may have guessed that already. That was very clever of you. There were lots more flies under there as well, and the sound of them all getting scared and taking flight at once was the cherry on top to the whole experience. You almost have to feel a little bad for those flies. How would you like it if you were having the banquet of a 28-day lifetime and somebody came along and just tore the roof off the place? However, when I said rotting flesh, I didn't mean a dead body. I meant multiple dead bodies. Now, what you might be imagining is bodies laying side by side, somewhat neatly stacked. That ain't it either, Jack. It was multiple bodies, dismembered into many pieces, jumbled together in a pile, just as cluttered as the rest of the shit laying around everywhere. The stumps weren't straight or clean. They'd obviously been ripped apart, not cut. Everything seemed to have been laying there for at least a few days. I didn't see any clothes, but I did see pelvises of both men and women with flies clumped around the genitals. There were heads, too, with wide open mouths and eyes, flies flavoring both, partially bitten out of with exposed bone and flesh, just like every other body part in the pile. I turned to run as soon as I saw it, staggering, and as soon as I made it outside, vomit with a strong taste of venison came rushing out of me. It didn't feel too great to keep on running right after that, but run I did, spitting out the excesses off to the side. I recalled that last detail as I finished the first cigarette, and once again became aware of the taste in my mouth, now mixed with beer and fresh tobacco. Lucky for me, Grandfather Red Eagle kept some spare toothbrushes in the bathroom. You know, you really ought to be doing this every day, I said to my reflection as I spit out the rinse water, especially now that you have a place to stay. No excuses. I set the toothbrush against the wall under the mirror and wiped my face off. I started off toward the coffee table again, thinking about another cigarette, but I stopped. I turned around, got a good long look at the shower, and started to strip. Then I stopped myself again and checked under the sink. The Indian had a bottle of bubble soap. Now with a new urgency, I ran back to the living room. I grabbed the tobacco bag, a whiskey bottle from the kitchen cupboard, then went to the bedroom to look for a pipe. It was the first time I'd ever been in Grandfather Red Eagle's bedroom. There was another beaded tapestry on the wall, the biggest and the prettiest in the whole place, depicting a forest, mountains on the horizon, and a full moon at the top with a wolf howling at it. There were framed paintings on the walls, paintings of more wolves, herds of horses, and various settings of cowboys and Indians in the frontier days, mainly around campfires. Every spot on the walls not taken up by pictures had dream catchers of various sizes hanging from it. They must have been for the moon dreams. The pipe sat on a hutch, so I took one of the cheaper-looking ones. I was about to leave when I noticed the hutch's high shelf occupied by a stereo, which served as a bookend for a CD collection lined up and spanning the entire shelf. I set the stuff in my arms on the bed and had a look. It was mostly rock from the 60s and 70s, Skinner, Dire Straits, Rolling Stones, you know the deal. I sifted through until I inevitably found what I was looking for. I took the CD and the stereo and scooped up the rest of everything off the bed, then took it to the bathroom to set it all up. Now, before anyone tries to make fun of me, let me make this crystal clear. Guys can take bubble baths too, especially after they've just been witness to the most unspeakable evil that anyone's ever seen in a tweaker encampment. The only rule is that the dainty glass of wine must be replaced by a bottle of whiskey held by the neck and drunk from directly. I fired up the pipe and tasted its sweetness as the stereo sang to me. I lit up from Reno, I was trailed by 20 hounds. Didn't get to sleep that night till the morning came around. Set out running, but I take my time. A friend of the devil is a friend of mine. I got a good buzz going from the whiskey and leaned back against the wall, gazing at the tobacco clouds, trying to focus on that instead of the rotting body part snapshots that still persisted. I dared not close my eyes for longer than a blink, or they'd be all I could see. Ran into the devil, babe, he loaned me 20 bills. Spent the night in Utah in a cave up in the hills. I dunked my head under the water and came back up, set the smoldering pipe down on the edge of the tub, and rubbed my eyes. The catharsis was unreal when the colors and shapes made by the rubbing took precedence over the mental pictures. If I get home before daylight, just might get some sleep tonight. I carried on like this for the rest of the album. When it finished playing, the thought of reaching for the button to start it over crossed my mind, but I was too close to dozing off to muster up the energy. My eyelids were getting heavy, as they do. I noticed my jaw begin to slacken, but I didn't care. Dreamland was approaching fast. Never mind. I snapped back to attention when I heard the front door open. For just a split second, I was consumed with dread, imagining that it was Darcy, once again about to catch me drunk in the bathroom, but this time naked and horizontal, taking a bubble bath of all fucking things I could be doing. It would honestly be better if she caught me jacking off, that way I'd at least have time to pull my pants up before my death. An entire movie played in my head of her coming in, reaching her claws into the bathtub, easily sidestepping my clumsy and desperate efforts to stand up, ripping me open with absolute ease, her angry eyes being the last thing I see as she bites right into the middle of my torso. But no worries. It was just the two werewolves. Thank God. I relaxed again. Grandfather Red Eagle poked his head in and grinned. "Hey, bro. I see you found the boombox." "Yeah, hope you don't mind," I said. I grabbed a pipe that looked less fancy than your other ones, too. "Yeah, bro," said the Indian. "Whatever's good in your eyes. Mi casa, su casa." "What's going on?" Charles called from the kitchen. "Oh, nothing. Nicholas is just living it up in here is all." Charles came over to see what he meant. He was holding a case of Bud Light. He looked at me and grinned. "Bubble bath, huh?" For just a moment, I felt a slight rush of creeping fear from looking at them. There they stood, both grinning with teeth just a hair too sharp, striking my brain's primitive function of facial recognition as not fellow humans. Quickly, though, I shook the thought. I grinned back at Charles. "Yeah, a bubble bath," I said. "You got a problem with it, tough guy?" "Not at all," said Charles, "but I'd hop out if you want some of this beer." I sat up. "I'll get out in a minute here," I said. "There's actually something I want to tell you guys about." "Tell us when you get out," said the Indian. "We're about to get a fire going out front." I said all right, and that was the end of the conversation. They went out front and the door shut. I got out of the tub and realized I didn't have a towel ready, so I ran my fingers through my soppy hair to drip out the excess water and put my clothes back on. I figured the fire would dry me out and have me smelling like smoke before long anyways, so I dealt with the dampness. It could have been worse, all things considered. Chapter 24. "No, I ain't never done that," said Grandfather Red Eagle. "What about you, Charles?" Charles shook his head. I was outside sitting around the campfire with them. We were using one of those portable iron fire pits with legs that stood on wheels. Charles was holding the poker that came with it like a cane, just like in Utah. I just asked if either of them had ever made a practice of stashing human bodies after they'd huffed and puffed all over them. "I usually just leave them where I found them if I don't eat the whole thing," said Charles. "At least from what I can piece together." "Right," said the Indian. "And that sounds like something only man would do. When the moon's out, you're in the state of the demon wolf. You're not really thinking like man does. And we really try to avoid going after human beings," Charles added. "Mostly through precautions before the full moon does take place, and once you start getting used to the whole thing, you're more able to think with your man side, so you can recognize, hey, that's a person and I should probably leave them alone." "So why do people still get attacked by werewolves then?" I asked. "Like, why did you come after Charles and all those cops that one time if you'd already been a werewolf for so long?" This question caused the Indian to shift in his seat. He looked down for a moment and took a deep breath, searching for words. He looked up and said, "It's possible, Nicholas, but it ain't always easy. When you're in the state of the demon wolf." He paused again for a moment before he continued. "Well, I'll put it to you like this. The demon wolf wants what it wants. When it smells fresh meat, it wants fresh meat. When a man's been used to the demon wolf for a while, and he's been building up the will of the soul with the discernment, it's a lot easier for the soul to jump in, and fight with the demon wolf when it wants to go do something wicked. But you gotta understand, bro, the stronger that fresh meat smell is, and the more sweet and juicy shit there is to munch on, the more the demon wolf wants to go get it. It's already hard enough when you're in that state," said Charles, throwing another log into the fire. "So when the smell gets really strong, you hunger for it more, and you kind of just forget that you really don't want to do it. He sat back in his chair and added, "It's like fighting your reflexes." I nodded, taking this all in. I leaned down to reach for a second beer from the case. "Well, that's all very fascinating," I said, cracking it open. "I bet it'll be interesting for the people reading the book. Honestly, I never thought it would be so complicated." "It's the burden we bear and the burden we share," said the Indian. "That and a whole gang of other shit." "It's why we drink," said Charles. "Amen to that, brother man." Grandfather Red Eagle raised his beer can, and Charles clinked against it, and they both proceeded to chug down the rest, crush the cans, and toss them into the fire. After a loud belch, Grandfather Red Eagle asked me, "So, anyways, what were you going to tell us?" Suddenly I remembered. I'd been so entranced in that whole story that I forgot the one I was about to tell myself. I gave them a summary of my lovely evening walk that day and how I'd thrown up and ran all the way back to the cabin, ending with, "And that's why I found it absolutely necessary to take a bubble bath with Grateful Dead and some whiskey." This sent them both into a roar of laughter, and I really mean a roar. The closer they got to transformation, the stronger and furrier their laughter tended to sound. "So that's what you were listening to, huh?" said the Indian. "Usually when I take a bath, I like to put on Barbra Streisand and pretend she's in there with me." That one got me laughing along with them. Once we all caught our breath, Grandfather Red Eagle spoke up again, this time in a steadier tone of voice. "So anyways, Nicholas, that was definitely your friend." There was a moment of silence after he said this, as he sipped his beer, until he said, "And honestly, it's pretty fucking crazy that you made it back. She's out there, though. That's one thing I can tell you for certain." Another pause while I let this take hold. "So why do you think I made it back?" I asked. "Because I didn't feel like I was being watched when I was coming back." "Oh, you bet your ass you were being watched, bro," said Grandfather Red Eagle. "And she was probably watching you go in there, too. That's why I told you not to stray off my property." "Yeah, that's true, my bad, but I have a question about that, though. Couldn't she just come inside the cabin? Because she came into that motel room, too, and I know the door was locked." "That's a good point," said the Indian, crushing his can and reaching for a third or fourth. "And honestly, bro, you should have died then, too. It can only mean one thing." He paused for effect and said, "She's waiting for something." Yet another pause. I'd never even thought of that before, which in truth was probably a merciful thing. "Wait," I said. "Charles, have you been filled in on all that Wendigo shit?" Charles grinned. "I heard the whole conversation. Wolfman hearing." "Oh, shit, I forgot, that's right. But wait, hold on a second." I wagged my finger back and forth at both of them. "Don't you guys have a special sense of smell on top of it? How come you didn't find the bodies before I did? I thought you could tell things apart by smell." "Well, yes, that's true," said Grandfather Red Eagle. "But first of all, we're not interested in shit that's already dead and rotting when what we're looking for is live animals. Second of all, and you might not like hearing this, bro, but personally, I smell dead human beings just about every fucking day. In the woods, in town, in the neighborhoods, just about every fucking place I go, I smell human death, so much that I gave up trying to investigate that shit a long time ago. Charles will probably tell you the same thing too." "Yet another reason why we drink," said Charles, raising up his can. By this time, he must have been on his 10th. I'd been so focused on talking and listening that I was still on my second. I quickly gulped down the rest of mine and opened up another. "What do you suppose she's waiting for?" Grandfather Red Eagle shrugged. "Shit if I know. Not that it matters. There's just one thing you gotta know." He leaned in. His half-changed eyes reflected the light of the fire, which seemed to crackle with more intensity as he spoke his next words. "The Wendigo," he whispered, "is above the mortal man. Its flesh is of no value. It doesn't need it to live. It don't matter how much you try to beat it and cut through its skin. It has one weak point and one alone, and that's the heart." "Like a vampire?" I was leaning in as well, my whisper matching the intensity of his. "No, not quite," he replied. "The vampire's heart is still flesh and blood like a mortal man's. The Wendigo is weak in the heart compared to its flesh. It's made of ice, and that's why it can live in the cold woods and not succumb to it like the mortal man does." "So, what do we do then, set her on fire?" Charles was still casually leaning back in his chair. He must have been used to the dramatic campfire storytelling. "Well, probably not," said the Indian, returning to a more casual state. "You'd have to burn through the flesh to get to the heart, and I'm guessing you ain't got no flamethrower." "Then what do we do?" My asking him this was less of a question about how to kill a Wendigo and more of a subtle plea for there to even be a possibility. Well, when my grandpapa used to talk about it, there was always a flaming arrow involved. I got a bow laying around somewhere, but I could never shoot the damn thing, so I suppose that's out of the question. But fire will do it if you can get to the heart? Well, yeah, but you don't necessarily need fire, though. Shit, you could leave that poker in this fire right here a while and have Charles stick her with it. No problem, said Charles. He smacked the poker on the edge of the fire pit and made the embers fly everywhere. He was drunk. I got a story to tell you now, though. I asked, who, me? Both of you, said Charles, closing his eyes and smiling. I haven't told either of you yet, but I can't die. He trailed off, nodding, and came back to reality, without getting it out. Die from what? I asked. Darcy? Charles began to fidget with the poker, turning it around and around and stabbing the burning logs. Darcy, he said, eyes still closed. Or anything. Or anybody. I don't know. I just need to get it out. Nicholas, get your notebook and come back. To that I replied, You got it, cowboy, and jogged inside for my yellow pad. The trip there and back was a nervous one. I'd never seen Charles worry about his own death like that. Was it something Grandfather Red Eagle said? Was there something I was being kept in the dark about? I ran back to my chair and turned to a blank page, ready to take notes. It was the story, at long last, of how he was separated from his baby mother. If you were wondering about how I got the information for the last little flashback, it was the first half of what he told us right here. I just placed it after a cliffhanger and cut it off at another cliffhanger. Hopefully it made you squirm.